Good afternoon and most welcome to 11:35. Just make me move the microphone a little bit. And we will continue with the introduction or the first chapter of Richard E. Lin's marvelous book, The Seat of Consciousness in Ancient Literature. I myself had a rather strange experience this morning. I don't know, it felt like the heart consciousness or the heart soul, that everything was connected, and it felt that this was something pre-reflective, pre-verbal. I couldn't express it, and when I came to my senses or woke up and started putting everything into words, it disappeared. So it's just as Richard E. Lin describes it. But oddly enough, I also understood that this pre-reflective makes thinking much sharper when thinking started again. This is suggested by some logicians, for instance Graham Priest, that logic is a marvelous system, but we need to be free before. We need to understand that logic is coming from something greater. Otherwise we won't be able to create anew every time. This is also the view of intellectuality, thinking, rationality in East Asian countries like India, China, Korea. In China and India, the body is the intellect, and the body, B-O-D-H-I, is our rationality, and it's part of a three-partitive body-soul. And the intellect is in the heart. It is this green chakra. And we mentioned yesterday that thinking could be seen as breathing. That is the blood. It's the same thing. Pneuma, moving through the veins, the heart breathing. I know for most of you this sounds odd, but nowadays in medicine, heart and lungs are the same system. It is absolutely the same. We used to divide them, but there is no division possible. They work in concert, and that helped me to think that the whole region here is the heart. It's a mistake to think the heart to be the thing you can find on the dinner table, for instance, if you eat beef heart or something like that. No, this is the heart, all of it, the whole chest, maybe the whole circulatory system. So this is the first chapter where he put the board down for the whole book, and it's called Ancient Western Descriptions of Heart Consciousness. Though they were described as distinct manifestation, the differentiations of gods was not so clear-cut as modern readers might prefer, their boundaries being amorphous and dependent upon one's perspective. Or to put it in another way, the immanent states of mind represented by the gods were not mutually exclusive, but rather mutually interpenetrating and complementary. And, in an important sense, all were variations of a single form of consciousness. For example, in the ancient Egyptian religion, compound gods were common, such as Amun-Ra, often amalgamating quite different and even opposing attributes. For instance, Amon, the hidden one, Re or Re, the eternal and external sons. That is S-U-N-S, sons. Into one identity, though in this case the God may represent developmental or transitional concept. It is likely that the interchangeability of the souls, e.g. their bodies of light of the gods, reflected what might be called a lack of boundaries, characteristics of ancient consciousness. Some of the phenomena associated with these permeable boundaries in primitive consciousness have been referred to by anthropologists as animism, which in this case accounted to an experience that could be described as an unconditional, intuitive and emphatic sharing of a common, immanent source of consciousness, with whatever was the objective focus of attention. A comparable notion is found in Christianity, for example as agape, an intuitive knowing and love of the divine inherent in the awareness of all persons and objects, but an awareness only made possible by virtue of a current awareness of the divine in oneself. However, the experience might be understood in modern terms. Inhibition or possession of the heart of the individual by a god or an ancestor was commonplace in ancient religious literatures. This inhabitation seems often to have involved multiple spiritual beings, suggesting that the pagan heaven in the heart was at times a populated world or extended family, rather as it was experienced later. The more commonly limited individualistic patterns of singular identity communing successive on an one-to-one basis with each god, angel, guide, or in ancestor in turn. In later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this experience of inhabitation seems to have become, for the most part, monistic, there being only one deity or spiritual entity whom it was permissible to host in the heart. For example, Bernard of Clairvaux and his description of the religious conversion of the heart has been summarized as follows. God is received into the innermost heart. He enters the soul. He touches and excites the heart. It was therefore usually a singular God, for example, one of the Christian Trinitarian manifestation, e.g. Christ, or in Islam, an angel that was reported in descriptions of medieval Western experience of the heart-soul. This unitary trend may have paralleled a similar trend toward a singular as opposed to multiple body souls. But the apparent incompletion of this collective transition toward unification has so far resulted in the perversion of consciousness into the current mind-body split of the benighted modern self. whether or not a dogmatic monism of religion has been achieved in the West, as long as the body and mind remain estranged, a monism or unity of psychological and therefore also religious experience cannot be achieved. The only remedy for this mind-body split seems to be the recovery of the consciousness of the body as a whole, or what was referred to in the past as a heart-soul. That the heart-soul is an imminent solution to this problem has been repeatedly demonstrated in Western descriptions of spiritual experiences. But the rarity of these experiences in modernity raise questions about the viability and effectiveness of efforts to recover and maintain this form of consciousness in modern circumstances. In contrast to the inner complexity and interchangeability of souls or identities in their internal religious experiences, all ancient cultures seem to have promoted the development of an externally oriented social personality that defined each individual's functional identity in the community and the social interactions outside of the family. Judging from descriptions of the modern self, the ancient social and functional role of or community identity contributed more to the modern conception and experience of the self than the ancient heart soul that represented the inner spiritual world of lineage identity. For example, in common phrases, the Egyptians distinguished between face and heart, the former referring to outward appearance in the present, and the latter to an inner evaluation affected by remembrance and comparison with values associated with the past and future. Insofar as the social role represents the probable origin of the modern self, whose subjectivity is located in the head, it is likely that at some point in history the externally oriented social self and the internal soul, whose subjectivity was located in the heart, became split off from each other and estranged, as if they had become two separate identities, one conscious, e.g. as the center of subjectivity, and the other unconscious, e.g. hidden in an obscure interior, or objectified, e.g. projected as the mind of the other. In a sense, the mind left the center of the body and became reoriented by the face or social self. This polarization of mind versus body was probably new, at least as an acceptable form of normative consciousness, and was probably created in a belated reaction to the absence of a body consciousness, especially in the more recent, uninitiated generations cut off from their lineage identities, that is, their memories of identification with the body as a whole, by the ineffectiveness and forgetting of the means to awaken the mind of the body. Something, e.g. the ineffectiveness of initiation rites, or more likely a combination of negative influences cause the heart to fail to become transformed, or after transformation to become impure, eventually causing the sacred space in the soul to fail to appear or disappear, that is, to be filled instead with the banalities of prosaic consciousness. Impurity more often than not refer to the heart's attachment to its passing contents, e.g. thoughts, desires, and its consequent distraction from awareness of itself, e.g. turning away, forgetfulness of the heart-soul. Distraction either prevented the appearance of the sacred or caused its disappearance, because of neglect and the resulting impurity and profanity of the consciousness of the prosaic, uninspired heart-soul, whose unguarded back door, e.g. the unconscious, split-off body, remained wide open to distracting and infernal influences. We are now wide open to demonic possessions in the modern time, because we left the back door open. We split it off from the body, and we have no longer any control of diabolical possessions. Religion, conceived in terms of purification, stability of awareness, and persevering remembrance of the duty of reverent attention to the sacred manifestations in the heart-soul, was the continual reseating and diligent cleansing of the soul in the heart, and the renewal, containment, and protection that maintain the devoted contemplation, e.g. worship, prayer, of an immanent divinity, of intermittent guests, ancestors, family gods, or in a more general sense, of an illuminated state of consciousness. But at least from the modern perspective, these seem to have been a very difficult, paradoxical inner discipline that usually required expert assistance and an extraordinary mindfulness, and may have become increasingly difficult to achieve and maintain in a civilized context. However, like many qualities that are retrospectively presumed to be the responsibility of the worshipper, a disciplined mindfulness capable of persistent, reverent attention may not have been possible prior to the transformation of the heart-soul. That is, the capacity necessary for the maintenance of the enlightened heart-soul came with its transformation, and was therefore not a preparatory discipline whose perfection caused or even facilitated the experience or maintenance of enlightenment. Discipline was important, but an extraordinary capacity for it, e.g., the all-reconciling single-mindedness of love of the one, could not be obtained prior to transformation, e.g., falling in love. And the erroneous attribution of the ability of an imitative discipline to cause such a transformation of the heart soul, as if one could successfully pretend to fall in love, was likely no more than an imaginary causal reconstruction of the past, bolstered by egotism and wishful thinking. Once the heart soul was judged to have become incurably impure, it was either rejected or ceased to function, and was replaced by a hierarchical and moralistic mind-body dualism. That is, a shift occurred in the localization of subjectivity from heart to head. More commonly, however, the shift from pre-adolescent head consciousness or body consciousness to a mature heart consciousness as focusing or reuniting of the body, that in the past had been accomplished through initiation rites and religious disciplines, ceased to occur. And this is when the back door to demonic possessions were permanently left open. I think that is a very apt description of the modern world. Something that we often, in a diminutive way, call the materialistic worldview of modern day. I think it's more fitting to say it's demonic possession. For these people, the soul was not lost because it had never been obtained, and having no knowledge of it except by hearsay, these people had little interest in realization of the heart soul except as a potential fulfillment of an abstract ego ideal, to be sought with spiritual disciplines that, over time, had become increasingly burdensome. Unrealistic and ineffective for the majority of those who practice them. The localization of subjectivity in the head may have been more or less normal. The natural but immature structure of youthful consciousness that simply persisted throughout the life of the individual, in the absence of its transformation during adolescence or later into the mature form of a holistic body consciousness, i.e., a transformed consciousness uniting through a descent into the body, mind and body, head and heart. Or another possibility is that an unconscious unity of youthful consciousness may have become divided by the hormonal stimulation of adolescence, which would normally in prehistory have been sublimated through initiation rites and adult training into the immanent governance of a conscious unity of mind and body. So if we don't have this knowledge, this apostolic succession of understanding through the body and words, not only words, we will not develop into maturity as a heart soul. We will be constantly splitted off from thinking and feeling. And what happens in this splitting off is that a new thing develops, the ego soul or the ego self. And the ego self, of course, has its own agenda, its own wishes, its own wants. And they can acquire the idea of wanting to have spirituality as an own thing, as a conquered thing. And for me, it rhymes with New Age, my experience from that, were people who might be very splitted off, but still had a want for something the ego self felt to be something maybe pleasurable, like a drug, or a happy state in the mind, like being happy that it's Christmas, some happy feeling to achieve, but situated not in the heart soul, but in the ego, and not felt, because the ego self can only wish, it wants something. And oddly, this is very similar to what Plato writes. He wants to be in the reality, the real world, but he constantly experiences himself not to be there. And as his want became stronger and stronger and stronger, the longer he came from his goal. And the bitterness at the end of his life clearly demonstrates that he was possessed by the ego self, like having what he had as an imitation or copying of a conventional way of thinking that he tried to achieve, hoping that it will give him the unity that his whole system so desperately had in want. Oh, let me repeat it, it's so good. But when these initiation rituals and the accompanying expert guidance were no longer available, the typical dualism of adolescence began to dominate conscious functioning. That is the worship of rather than the realization of maturational ideals, a premature falling in love with the opposite sex, and the physical maturation of sexuality without an accompanying psychological maturation. A very apt parallelism there. These adolescent dualisms or mismatches, e.g. unguided idealism of the conscious mind and sexual dominance of the unconscious mind, then remain fixated as the dysfunctional basis of a developmentally immature adult consciousness that, because of its divisive structure, e.g. conscious, unconscious, conscience, and conflictual functioning, could not on its own, without an external intervention, mature beyond an adolescent split between a conscious mind and an unconscious body. For those transformed or mature individuals who became impure, an upward movement from heart to head also entailed a shift in emphasis of attention from inner to outer, from the creative vital imagination of the animistic thought of the heart to a creative intellect focused on the abstract, practical, and problem-solving thoughts of the reasoning head, and from an animism of embodied souls to an idealistic seeking after abstract knowledge, unrealistic goals, and deceptive conceptions of happiness. For example, in the Greek philosophical preoccupation with eudaimonia or eudaimonia. That's fantastic. It was a possession. And that was also maybe the result of the Stoic turn. Neglect the spiritual and the world, and asceticism. They went in different direction, it seems, but they all had this splitting off of the body. Those who remained immature, e.g. uninitiated, probably eventually became the majority in the larger cities, where the youth who had been unable to become initiated, the displaced, survivors and loners, the abandoned and scapegoated, and slaves, and possibly even some of the younger brothers of the noble families, would naturally congregate and multiply until they become a potentially rebellious force, provoked by their own envy and resentment of the aristocracy that must be reckoned with. These uninitiated, unwanted city folk probably contributed to and participated in a culturally conditioned trend toward the historical predominance of a society primarily composed of individuals with an immature mode of understanding and knowing by means of intellectual and conceptual processes. An example is given here: the relatively sudden plague of itinerant sophists in the 5th century Athens. All of this, and probably numerous other factors, contributed to forgetting the unconditioned, non-verbal experiential forms of knowing that, as a family-based domestic religious tradition, probably preceded these later civilized developments during a time when the effective initiating rituals facilitating a transformation of the heart-soul into adulthood were still prevalent among extended families in small and remote rural communities and among the still mobile bands of extended families whose avoidance of civilization in some cases lasted until the early modern era. But the details of this hypothetical evolution or devolution of consciousness, if it occurred at all, are for the most part absent from the available ancient literature. However, once it is accepted that there was a prior form of consciousness seated in the heart, then it follows that something happened to it that eventually resulted in the modern structure and functioning of consciousness seated in the head. Unfortunately, the question of how and why these changes occurred may never be answered. Speculative reconstructions of this history, like the one offered above and its occasional elaborations below, will have to remain speculative reconstructions without adequate documentary evidence. By the 5th century BCE in Athens, it was evident in Plato's dialogues that many, if not most individuals, although they may have still been thinking with their hearts, were nevertheless not experiencing the type of awakened body consciousness associated with an ancient transformed heart-soul. Plato's description, for example, in the Republic, of an Athenian psychology dominated by the head and by the reasonable management of internal conflict, is a clear break from the psychological descriptions of Homer and even of some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Plato's apparent lack of knowledge of the transformed and enlightened heart-soul, based on his psychological description in the middle period of his work, suggests that by this time in Greek history, that is the 4th century BCE, the hypothetical collective loss of the heart-soul in ancient history, for the most part, had already occurred among most of those who participated in the rarefied intellectual atmosphere of Athenian Greece. Plato himself being a member of the nobility, might have been expected to know better, but since he apparently did not, he was apparently not successfully initiated either by his family or by the Pythagoreans in Italy. It is likely that the transformed, mature heart-soul was already becoming rare even among the aristocracy. Although Plato modified his views in later works, his dualistic legacy, e.g. the mind or soul versus body, remained one of the most authoritative bases justifying many of the deviations of later Western psychological and religious thought from its ancient roots, particularly after the majority of his works were translated from Arabic to Latin during the Renaissance. With Socrates and Plato, philosophy became unequivocally heretical, that is, dualistic, irreverent, from the point of view of many of the most ancient oral and domestic wisdom traditions. Hence the agreement of the Athenian aristocrats on the choices to give the original teacher of the dialectic of reasons, Socrates, suicide or banishment. To emphasize a hierarchical dialectical ascension rather than a mediatory and unifying assumption or dissension, was to advocate leaving the body behind as if it was an afterbirth to be discarded or a sacrificial portion to be fed to the dogs as the price of passage through the gates of hell. Wow, he's a writer, Richard E. Lynn. If, as it's probable, the heart soul had to somehow be earned, for example through initiation rituals, ascetic disciplines, in the cultural context of Hellenism, these were no longer practiced or no longer worked. The complaints and laments of all the generations and of the religious elite about the loss of ancient wisdom and the darkened hearts of their contemporaries would have fallen on deaf ears of the new generations, who would have no experience of, and therefore no idea or no more than a vague abstract conception of what their mainly aristocratic elders and sages were complaining about. In this new context, these aged and backward complainers, from the point of view of their naive and increasingly rebellious descendants, had become incomprehensible and therefore illogical, unreasonable, and unwilling to argue their points in an intellectual debate. They would not admit the progress inherent in freedom of thought from ancestral dogma as new generations rejected the Homeric wisdom tradition with its obvious flaws, irrelevant values, and dated psychology. Although much does seem to have been lost as a consequence of this shift from heart to head, it is impossible to fully appreciate this loss from the head-centered perspective of the Hellenic culture, or even from the historical overview available to modern scholars who have such an unprecedented access to historical documents. Three possible interpretations of the data collected below are: 1. There was a collective loss of the heart soul that promoted the creation of the traditional religions. 2. The heart soul was a new discovery in the evolution of consciousness, whose emergence in history prompted the creation of the traditional religions. 3. The traditional religions were more or less a continuation of the prehistoric religions, at least in the sense that there was no historically significant change in the frequencies or quality of the transformation of the heart soul that the early family-based religions claimed to foster. Greek literature addressing the experiential location of thought and feeling began with Homer. For example, in his description of Hector in the Iliad, and Hector knew the truth inside his heart and spoke aloud. One Greek term for the heart, kardia, designated the place of the soul's life, the effects and secret thoughts. Another term, thumos or themos, e.g. the breath in the chest, referred to the ardor, e.g. inspiration, that animated the feelings and thoughts of the heart. And this word was closely associated with one of root meanings of the word spirit. Pneuma was a synonym for the spirit and breath. As Homer described them, the inner senses of smell, sight, hearing, and touch, by which spirituality was perceived, was also experienced by the civilized Trojans and barbarian Greeks as faculties of the heart. The only hint of a head consciousness in Homer was in the wily character of Odysseus, who in Homer's second epic became a seeker of the way home, but had to go through extraordinary trials to get there. These trials may in part have been the consequence of how far he had drifted away from home, and in an important manner, Odysseus set the heroic pattern for modern Western romantic consciousness by the example of his wandering away from and quest to return home, Ithaca, back into the domestic interior and its fantastic difficulties, probably based on an earlier Herculean model of initiation through various divinely determined trials. Personal testimony about the heart has been preserved from the Greek mercenary soldier and poet Archilochus. His language has both metaphoric and literal implications that distinguish it from modern psychological discourse. Listen to this. Heart, my heart, so battered with misfortunes, far beyond your strength, up and face the men who hate us. Bare your chest to the assault of the enemy, and fight them off. Keep some measure in the joy you take in luck, and the degree you give way to sorrow. All our life is up and down like this. End of quote. Listen to this. Up and down is life. It was still an understanding how oppositions or contradictions fostered unity and a unidirectional way of life, not divergent into that fragmented state of consciousness that is the ego self or the reflective consciousness. Here it seems is a shared identity as well as an affiliation and discourse that gives the heart provenance in regard to certain qualities such as courage and emotion. The metaphoric usage is somewhat unusual by modern standards, but comprehensible in this translation. Although archilochous language may be a form of poetic license. There are enough similar statements from Greeks and from many other sources to justify exploring the literal interpretation of this type of ancient discourse, that the heart or the chest region, but not necessarily actual physical organs of the heart, was experienced by some exceptional if not all ancient individuals as a central subjective location, or at the very least as a kind of co-equal identity. This literal interpretation of ancient and primitive accounts of the localization of consciousness is easily dismissed until the near universality of this heart-centered perspective and the frequency of its explicit description in experiential rather than metaphoric language is more fully appreciated. The experiential language characteristics of these statements will be found in many of the illustrations used in this and in the chapters that follow. For example, the philosopher Chrysippus, 280-205 BCE, in the first book of his treatise on the soul, where he was attempting to prove that the location of the guiding principle of the soul was located in the heart, not the head, supported his argument by pointing out that when the Greeks say ego, we point with a gesture to our heart and not to the head. The fact that 1200 years later an Amerindian would use the same gesture to make a similar point tends to undermine the credibility of those who rely on language-based criticism to dismiss the experiential dimension of the ancient psychology of the heart-soul. An address to the heart of the speaker, similar to that of Archilochus, is found not only in the most ancient Egyptian literatures, but also in primitive reports and in more recent religious literatures. For example, in the medieval Alvar mystical poetry of South India. My heart, what is the use of staying here, pondering and melting away? Get up, let us go, worship Pulani, where jewels are carried ashore by the battling waves of the ocean. End of quote. This phenomenon of speaking to one's heart soul may reflect the fact that the ancient heart was frequently possessed or inhabited by another, e.g. ancestor god, in which case the heart soul would need to have been appropriately objectified in order to distinguish the individual from the current guests in the heart. And the anthropomorphic qualities of the guest inhabiting a human body would invite a dialogue, as occurred frequently, for example, in the Old Testament, and among the mystics of medieval Christianity. In this psychological context, the heart would be the dominant location of subjectivity, but there would also be an observer, the one who serves as host and sometimes addresses the heart soul and or its guests, seemingly as if from the perimeter or outside of the subjective realm, possibly in a sense similar to modern experience of the God's eye point of view, of the dreamer looking down upon himself in a dream, but likely less disembodied and more able to descend into in order to affect and participate in the heavenly dramaturgy below. A common theme and complaint in the history of discourse of the heart-soul is the independent willfulness of the comings and goings of the guests, that is, complaints about the soul or its guests leaving the heart and thereby as exciting along with the supernal influences from consciousness, despite the desire of the host that they remain. For the guest to leave caused great distress, but for the soul, e.g. identity and consciousness, to leave the heart was life-threatening, at least in primitive cultures. Whether the soul was an entity separate from the influences of its inhabitants was a point of contention. At least between Buddhism and Hinduism. But for this discussion, the existence of the heart soul, apart from its inhabitants, for instance, as an empty vessel of light, will be assumed for the sake of reducing the number of distinctions that need to be clarified in the course of the following argument. A preliminary appreciation of the geographic pervasiveness of the ancient psychology of heart-soul requires a lengthy historical review of the literary evidence, which will begin below with the Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt. As an ancient proverb states, for the Sumerians and Babylonians, my heart is wisdom, my reins are counsel, my liver is lordliness. These ancient Mesopotamians would have experienced the numinous as immanent, that is, as emerging from within, usually in the form of a personal God incarnate with his or her powers in the human individual. The numinous, numinous was the indwelling spirit and power of the many phenomena and situation, and it differed with each of them. Thus, ancient Mesopotamian religion was conditioned to a pluralistic view. As a tendency to see numinous power as immanent led to the ancient Mesopotamian to name that power and attribute form to it in terms of the phenomenon, so it also determined his ideas of that power's function. The numinous power appeared fulfilled in the specific situation or phenomenon and did not reach out beyond. When the God was immanent, he or she brought the spirit, the numinous, into being, and there was no discernible difference between the will of the God and the will of the being it inhabited. The deity made no demands, did not act, merely came into being, was, and ceased being in with its characteristic phenomena. End of quote. And I think this is extraordinarily interesting. When God enters into the heart soul of the human, there is no difference between the will of the God and the will of the being inhabited. This is something completely rejected by the reflective consciousness. It cannot understand that two opposing wills makes for one unified will. They see a competition here. They see an either or. And I would say that either or comes from the very split that we have in our systems. That split could well be the difference that we put into dorsal and ventral, mixing them and making the distinctions in the wrong places, by the neck region, by the pelvis, and forcing that, stopping our free-flowing wave, stopping our development into maturity and progress into more and more understanding. And we will permanently stay as immature children forever and ever, letting the back door be open to what you could call, from an ancient perspective, demonical possessions. I think this calls for some coffee. I need to repeat this is too grand. The deity made no demands, did not act, merely came into being, was, and ceased being in, and with its characteristics phenomena. Though it could be said that the presence of divinity made all the difference in terms of what was done and what not done, in both Sumerian and Akkadian languages, the phrase used to describe luck and good fortune meant literally to acquire a god. And the ancient Mesopotamians were never in doubt as to the identity of any personal God and could identify him or her as a known figure of the pantheon. And such a person had such and such a God as his personal God, who minded on continuous basis. Daily worship your God with offerings, prayers, and appropriate incense. Bend your hearts to your God that befits the office of personal God. Although the personal God was typically experienced in the heart or liver, Mesopotamian literature does not often refer to the physical location of the seat of consciousness. Nevertheless, there are sufficient direct and indirect indications of the material quoted below about the role of the heart in Mesopotamian psychology to warrant confidence in the following summary in its historical presence and importance. In ancient Sumer, the late 3rd millennium BCE, located in the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the earliest legendary literature described a god, a king, who had two births, one human and one divine. For example, in a hymn, the goddess Ninsuna says to her child Shulgi, "On my holy lap I raised you, at my holy breast I determined the destiny for you." Later Nana, the tutelary deity of Ur, Abraham's hometown, intervened in the assembly of the gods for the twice-born king Shulgi with a statement, "Bless the just king, whom I have called to my holy heart." End of quote. This twice-born Sumerian king, with his holy chest, was able to discern the words that were in the heart, to determine the true from the false. Among those who were specifically described as having holy hearts were Inanna. A prayer to Nanna contains the following lines: "O Nanna, whose penetrating gaze searches the bowels, may their hearts that have suffered so much evil appear pure to you. May the hearts of those who are in the land appear good to you." Another goddess, Nintur, was referred to as the Lady of Form-Giving and as Mother Nintur, working in a dark place, the womb, literally heart, to give birth to kings and to lords. A 3rd millennium text describes Lord Ningursu's heart as follows: Your heart rising as rise the waves in mid-ocean, crashing down as crash the breakers. Roaring like the waters pouring through a breach in the dike, destroying cities like a flood wave, rushing upon the enemy country like a storm. O my master, your heart a torrent from a breach in a dike, not to be stemmed. Warrior, your heart remote and unapproachable, like a far-off heavens. How can I know it? End of quote. In one of the canonical lamentations from ancient Mesopotamia, Enlil took counsel in his own heart, and prayers were offered to the one who knew his own heart, and who in turn knew the hearts of each of the gods and heroes. In the hymn to Enlil, Enlil is referred to as follows: What has he planned? What is my father's heart? What is in Enlil's holy mind? What has he planned against me in his holy mind? End of quote. Enlil, along with his associate hero gods, were each described as a storm cloud lying on the horizon, its heart inscrutable. And in another lamentation, Inanna says, Calm, doorkeeper, open up. May I touch his heart, may I calm his heart, may I pacify his liver, may I direct words to his heart and liver, may I direct words to that tired heart. In a Sumerian tale, Dumiz's wedding, the goddess Inanna says, My heart has pondered what I am about to let you know. Similarly, when Inanna, queen of the heaven, requested entrance to the underworld, Eresh Kigal, queen of the underworld, took the matter into her heart and dwelt on it. That the Sumerian gods and heroes fought with their hearts is further implied in another of the canonical lamentations from ancient Mesopotamia, where the question was asked, When will your heart tire from thinking? End of quote. Kan kolla att jag är film.
Vill du ha?
So Turkey på play.
Ja, det är play.
Okay.
Ser det bra ut?
Ja, precis. Everything looks fine.
Enlil, along with his associate hero gods, were each described as a storm cloud lying on the horizon, its heart inscrutable. In another lamentation, Inanna says, "Come, doorkeeper, open up. May I touch his heart? May I calm his heart? May I pacify his liver? May I direct words to his heart and liver? May I direct words to that tired heart?" In the Sumerian tale, Dumi's wedding, the goddess Inanna says, "My heart has pondered what I'm about to let you know." That was a bit of a repetition. In addition, the following phrase occurs, which suggests the importance of heart in Babylonian thought and experiences. Shazu, who knows the heart of the gods who see through the innermost parts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, 1850 BC, it was not until Gilgamesh's alter ego, Enkidu, a comrade who would understand his Gilgamesh's heart, lay with a woman that he had acquired wisdom, and the thoughts of a man were in his heart, following which Enkidu and Gilgamesh slay the bull of heaven and offered its heart to the sun god. Abush discovered in another Babylonian creation myth that the seat of intelligence, Temu, was experienced both in the heart, Uppu-Libbu, and the blood, Damu. Further, heart and blood was specifically associated with the personal god of Babylonian individual. In addition, the transition to the afterlife, the body produced a form from which a ghost ancestor was created. According to Abush, the Mesopotamian did not formulate his own personal psychology primarily in the form of internal categories. Rather, he objectified and externalized major aspects of the self. He could thus be surrounded by a series of divine beings who represented aspects of the self, or perhaps even different or body souls. Among these divine beings are the personal god and goddess. The personal gods and ancestors both represented the spiritual parents of the present and past respectively, in their exemplary role as guide through life and beyond into collective lineage identity, whose form was based on the consciousness of an original ancestor. These first Sumerian Babylonian literatures that refer to the heart in the second millennia BCE are, along with the Rig Veda in India, some Egyptian texts and the Gathas in Persia, among the most ancient indicators of what early civilized and possibly even pre-civilized consciousness may have been like, as will be more clearly demonstrated in the case of Egypt. This ancient heart soul was apparently, at least to some degree, interchangeable with the heart souls of the gods, ancestors, and other spiritual entities, in the sense that they sometimes inhabited or were experientially located in the heart. Instead of being exclusive or individualistic, as in modernity, ancient identities were inclusive, additive, and complementary, as for example in the 3rd century BCE quote from the Rig Veda: "When may I in my person converse with that deity? When may I be admitted to the heart of Varuna?" I will address this new laudatory hymn to the ancient Agni, who is gratified by praise. May he hear us. May I be in the center of his heart, to touch it like a loving, well-attired wife in the heart of her husband. I offer praise with all my heart to Agni, the drinkers of water, whose back is sprinkled with the soma, the ordainer of the right. End of quote. Descriptions like this, and especially of an exchange of human and divine hearts, were reported millennia later in the Sacred Heart literature of Christianity, and most notably among Western medieval women mystics. The most commonly reported ancient sacred experience in the heart was inhabitation of the human heart soul by an ancestor god, or what probably amounted to the same thing, replacement of the human heart by the heart of an ancestor or god. In Christianity, that would be Jesus or God, or might the Holy Spirit. Also emerging during the beginning of the written record, in which psychological and religious descriptions of consciousness first appear in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, the ancient Egyptians considered the heart to be an inner sun, and in the earliest religious, e.g. funerary text of Egypt, the heart was singled out as the essential psychospiritual organ whose truth or falsity, ma'at, determined the fate of the soul. Quote, the Ba was called the heart soul and the Ku was called the spirit soul. The Ba appears on earth as the Ku appears in heaven. In the ideograms, the bird image of the Ba exhibits a radiant plum emerging from its heart. The Ku bird bears a similar flaming plume emerging from the crown. Together, these birds form the double soul of divine heart and divine intelligence. While the importance of the heart soul was undeniable in Egyptian psychology, identity was a complex of separate influences, if not entities, including the Jekt body, the Hau body, belly heart, Ba soul, Ka soul, shadow and name. To single out any of these and emphasize its importance must rely upon an artificial construction of meaning that necessarily would be decontextualized from ancient Egyptian psychological experience as a whole. Given the current state of knowledge, anything purporting to be a truthful representation of the ancient psychology can be no more than a patchwork of guesses. Nevertheless, the importance of the Ba as the soul or mind of the body is unquestionably given in its frequent emphasis in the ancient Egyptian literature. I just need to say here, I'm starting to realize more and more that the heart soul is the seat of understanding, and understanding in its core is always contradictory, because the body carries, as it is as a vessel or as the Klein bottle, contradiction in itself. It is built up of contradiction, fosters contradictions, and produces contradictions. And that split here, I would say, wasn't healed until the advent of quantum mechanics. And those people who sort of understood quantum mechanics must have turned to their heart soul, because there can be no true understanding of complementarity in the ego self or the reflective consciousness. Because reflective consciousness is by default always in its basis non-paradoxical. There is no entrance of complementarity, paradoxality, or the situation between something that is a superposition and something that is explicit, the collapse of the superposition, the true fact, because it's either or always. The ego self is built up of either or. It cannot stand on two legs. It cannot be a stable construct. And therefore, all understanding of complementarity must come from the heart soul. It is here where paradoxes, so to speak, resides. They inhabit this place, because this is also the seat of understanding itself. The transcendental understanding cannot be paradoxical. I got this idea from a discussion I saw on the net a couple of months ago, where Bernardo Kastrup's homepage, which has grown enormously the last couple of years, an attack, well, sort of a revision of Graham Priest's paraconsistent logic was put into place. And my feeling was directly, if you're going to be a solipsist or an idealist like Bernardo Kastrup's philosophy is based on, you cannot have paradoxes. They need all to be taken apart or resolved into what would be nullification. So it needs to be consistent, non-paradoxical, coherent system, just like what Gödel tried to make of mathematics and has been tried so many times. Noam Chomsky in language, Peter Hjelstad in logic. We have so many examples, and that cannot take in complementarity. And I would say that is also the reason so many of the professors of quantum mechanics always sort of jump back to non-complementarity. They can admit it when they are in the laboratory, but in their personal life, as witnessed by my friend Sigge Christiansson, they always directly, when they leave the office, their calculations, jump directly back to the non-paradoxical, non-complementary, one-legged normal situation. Because this is normality of today. Normality itself is put into question by complementarity. And I think that is at the core of the problem. But it was a very good and interesting article in Bernardo Kastrup's page. Well written and everything, and I was still surprised why he could not accept for a consistent logic, and thereby not accepting complementarity, and thereby not accepting Gödel's theorem. For the Egyptians, the soul, Ba, life, thought, will and wisdom resided in the heart, which became a locus of personality, and at the end of its earthly sojourn, witnessed and testified about the deeds, as it were, of its host, or of the soul of its host. The association of the physical and spiritual heart with the Ba is made clear in spell 45 from the coffin texts. Truly, so long as thy Ba shall exist, thy heart Ib shall be wise with you. This text suggests the distinction between the soul, Ba, and the physical heart, Ib, that was usually overlooked in the literature about the heart soul because of the common understanding that the soul was located near the heart, but was not simply the physical heart itself. Very important. I would say when reference to the heart could also possibly be translated as the totality of a human, its intellect, its spiritual intentions, its joy, its sense of being present, experiencing, all those are in the unity of paradoxes. One of the earliest texts to address the role of the heart is from the 16th century BCE, Papyrus of Ani, also referred to Book of the Dead. Chapter of giving the heart to Osiris, Ani to him in the netherworld. Ani saith, may my heart be with me in the house of hearts. May it rest in me. I know my heart. I have gained power over my heart. I have gained power to do what pleaseth my Ka. Chapter of not allowing to be driven away the heart of Osiris, the scribe of the divine offerings of gods, all Ani, triumphant from him in the netherworld. He saith, my heart, my mother, twice, my heart, my coming into existence. Thou art my double within my body, forming and making strong my limbs. Mayest thou come forth to the place of happiness, to which we advance there. End of quote. Excuse me. So to build up a conclusion here, the paradoxical mind is the heart-soul mind, and I will infer a little bit from Indian theology and Indian worship of the fire in the heart, or general worship of fire in the heart. Fire, Agni as it's called in Indian, but also used by Heraclitus, takes a very dominant role. Worship of the fire in the heart. We may suppose that the domestic fire was in the beginning only the symbol of worship of the dead, that under the stone of the hearth an ancestor reposed, that the fire was lighted there to honor him, and that this fire seemed to preserve life in him, or represent his soul as always vigilant. From a fragment of one of the Sumerian sources of the Gilgamesh epic comes the following exchange. Did you see him who was set on fire? I saw. How does he fare? His spirit is not about. His smoke went up in the sky. I come to send fire on the earth, and what will I if it be already kindled? A proverb of the primitive Africa Ba'ila states, the God that speaks up is the one that gets the meat. End of quote. As Coulanges 1980 emphasizes in ancient Western history, there was a close connection between the worship of the dead and the sacred fire. In every ancient Indian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman house, there was a hearth, usually an altar or altars, in which was maintained a sacred fire that must be kept going day and night. The altar fire was always placed in an enclosure or concealed in the interior of the house. The gods worshipped at these sacred fires, including the ancestors, was referred to as the consecrated gods or gods of the interior. To all acts of this religion, secrecy was necessary. If a ceremony was looked upon by a stranger, it was disturbed, defiled, made unfortunate simply by this look. The gods of the interior referred not only to the interior of the house, but also the interior of the worshipper as the living host of the gods and ancestors. Since the interior was associated with the sacred, and the sacred with secrecy, psychological experience in the interior of the body was a personal or family matter. Very important, very interesting. And a subject of discussion among them only in unusual circumstances. Such as the preparation of youth for initiation rituals. Likewise, even in later sacred texts written for a select audience of initiates, internal experiences were referred to very sparingly, only in general terms, and these impressive hints were often further concealed in esoteric symbolism that allowed nothing of an individual or personal nature to be revealed, unless it be the prognostic idiosyncrasy of a prophet or a founder of a religion. The most important reason for concealment of the interior was the fear that the ancestors or gods might become displeased, as apparently any outside exposure was potentially disturbing to their tranquility, evoking the evil eye of curiosity and suspicious scrutiny of both the worshipper and worshipped through the gaze of the profane. To invite an other outside of the family to share in one's interiority would have been to invite them to engage in the invidious comparisons of an objectifying critical conscience. Further, such an invitation would have been inappropriate, since the interior was the private realm where the family ancestors and gods were worshipped. Their presence or absence was the primary criterion for judging the efficacy of worship. No substantial literature describing the internal experience of these practices exist, although the Rig Veda and Upanishads provide clues about the central role of the heart soul and of the fire, e.g. light, in this worship. I would make a conclusion here, and that is that I clearly see now how our stepping away from the internality of this realization, by putting it under a light that is everywhere, we burn away it. Truth is what hides. This is what Heraclitus said, and Heidegger would say, in the covering and uncovering, this is where everything is coming to fore. And that is a movement. If you stick to only the covering, you will be lost. But as we do normally today, uncover everything, we block out the heart. So I can add to my former characteristics that on top of non-paradoxical, being of no paradox, the heart, the reflective ego, is also that shines in a very peculiar way. It shines away truth. It doesn't allow for truth to enter, because it blocks out it by putting too much light on it. And that light is not natural. It is more like a fluorescent bulb, those luminous things we have in the roofs these days or in the ceilings that turns everything out and puts an artificial light on everything everywhere, and a light that doesn't allow for the hiddenness of truth to come to the fore. It burns away distinctions. Almost like the epoch of illumination, with all this lore of the ego self of burning everything away, making everything absolutely clear. And why not think about Lord Kelvin, who said, clarity is coming soon, we just need a few decimals and everything is finished. And as was advised to Max Planck when he was looking for his career, stay away from physics because it's already finished. It has already come into clarity. Not a thing more needs to be done. Everything is now behind us. And I think the idea of clarity is maybe the strongest one within the ego self. It is this idea, put everything into the open, and thereby we understand everything. But what we do in the reflective light, and this is coming also from Rodolphe Gasquet, is that we have the nullification, direct mirroring. We don't understand anything. There is no true reflection. We just repeat, imitate. We have become soulless because there is no reflection. Nullification by Rodolphe Gasquet, it's too much light and we just see the mirror image as the only truth, usually designated to the thing looking into the mirror, and we make some sort of equalization. Although there is a time lapse, it takes time for the light to go from one place to the other, the chain of the mirror will disrupt the light, the reflection will not be the same, therefore you have no idea how you actually look, but you see that as the original. And I would say original also comes into the play here. Original, the seek for the origin. As Kalle said the other day, could be two origins, two originals. What do you do then? Destruction. Catastrophe. A disaster of the mind. We do not advance anything. It's a stalemate looking into the mirror. And you could say that above for non-paradoxality, non-contradiction, attacks on Graham priests, all those things are concluding the ever light, because the ever light doesn't make contradiction possible. You can see contradiction as the thing that lies in the dark. If you put too much light, contradictions are no longer possible. And think of yin and yang, black and white. You can see the black as the night, and it is the night. The yin factor is the night factor, and it hides. That is not allowed. A modern yin-yang symbol is one white circle. There's no movement, it's an absolute standstill. There's no process anymore. There are no contradictions. Everything lay bare out in the open. This openness is no knowledge, it's no understanding, it doesn't make for any reflection, because for the darkness to see the white, it needs to be a difference. In sameness, there are no recognitions, there are no understanding. An idea I think I got from yesterday's Susie Frobel lecture about fractality. A fractal that is not different doesn't progress, and it doesn't read itself off. It's a standstill. it has sort of passed away, like the soul has ceased to exist. It's no longer participating in the light and in the darkness. It doesn't allow for reflection, because in the ever stronger light of the idea of illumination, the reflective consciousness, the ego self, light is everywhere, from beneath, from beyond, but it's not a purifying light, it's a demonic light that tricks us. And we want to go into that light. I think that is even described sometimes. I do have some remembrance, but it's obviously an idea of Plato, because the cave people are standing in darkness. The light is behind them, they cannot see the light, and the reflection on the wall is all they see, and they strive for the true light. This is the false light. So he still knew that he had a fire, a light in his heart, and he wanted to get there, but he was lost, he was possessed, he was immature. He had never been initiated or made into one with the intellect and the heart still functioning. Actually, in many ways, Plato doesn't further philosophy. He just states what is already done. He restates it, he reformulates it, he makes it even more clearer, thereby making it even less of anything, obliterating the little knowledge that he had from the beginning, shining his light everywhere, putting everything into clearance, making everything distinct as he thought, thereby making all obscure, not turning anywhere, not going anywhere, and laying the foundations for an even stronger turn away from understanding and knowledging, an understanding that is also hidden and light, yin and yang. Or why not the Holy Cross, which shines from behind in many icons? This is what I usually think, which makes the cross possible to be a cross. Because if it didn't shine from behind, nothing would be discerned, nothing would be exact. Too shiny of light doesn't leave any properties left for us to understand and for us to fathom, so to speak. By difference we fathom, different fractalities, iterations, not repetitions. I can conclude there. Plato is definitely repetitions. Iterations is the better working of the heart. I say thank you very much. It was a pure pleasure. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and bye-bye for now.